Greetings. We are still in January, but we're about to hit February. We are still between the wedding at Cana and Jesus' first appearance at Passover in Jerusalem. So, Tuesday, January 31st, 30 AD, Shabbat the 9th. On their return journey to the inn outside Ono, Jesus and the disciples spent the greater part of the day on the road, only 1 hour long, from Nebo to the Jordan ferry. Jesus taught the whole way. The road was bordered by huts and tents in which people from Nebo sold to travelers fruit and distilled wine. It was these vendors that Jesus instructed. Before evening, he returned with the disciples to his inn at the place of baptism. Wednesday, February 1st. Jesus went afterward through the surrounding district, instructing the peasants singly and in crowds. Among them were many good souls who, during that time that John was baptizing here, supplied the crowds with food. Jesus appeared to be seeking out everyone, even those in the most remote corners, for he was soon to leave these parts and go on to Galilee. Thursday, February 2nd. There was here an old dilapidated teacher's chair, formerly used by the prophets. The peasants had restored it very handsomely, and from it Jesus delivered his instructions. Several such places for teaching had been restored since John had here baptized. He had ordered it too, for that too was part of his preparing his way. These teaching chairs had here, as with us, the pictures of the stations, quite gone to ruin since the time of the prophets. Elijah and Elisha had frequented this part of the country. Jesus celebrated in Ono the morning of the Sabbath, which was followed by a feast that must have had some connection with fruit. I saw whole basketfuls carried during those days into the synagogue and town halls. The arrangements at the place of baptism had already been taken apart and stowed away by the disciples. Near the spot upon which the stone of the Ark of the Covenant lay, there were now scattered around about 20 dwellings. Bethabara was not close to the shore, but about 1/2 hour from the ferry. One could see it, however. From the ferry to John's present place of baptism beyond Bethabara was a good 1.5 hours distance. Friday. I saw Jesus going from house to house at Ono. At first I knew not for what reason, but later I heard that it was on account of the tithes, to the paying of which he was urging the people. He reminded also of the alms which it was customary to give on the Feast of Fruit Trees, now beginning. That evening he celebrated the Sabbath in the synagogue, where he taught. Saturday. After that began the preparations for the New Year's Fruit Festival. Throughout the day, Jesus taught in Ono concerning the threefold meaning of the approaching feast. Firstly, it commemorating the rising of the sap in the trees. Secondly, because today tithes of all fruit were offered. And lastly, it was a feast of thanksgiving for the fertility of the soil. I skipped to Monday because Sunday is just an italicized description. Monday, they ate much fruit and gave to the poor whole figures of fruit that were built up on the tables. About 20 new disciples had, up to the present, come to Jesus. Subtext. Jesus cures in Phasael, the daughter of Jairus the Essene, Magdalene's first call to conversion. At the close of the feast, Jesus left Ono with 21 disciples and journeyed to Galilee. His way led through the region in which Jacob had owned a field, and among those shepherd houses from one of which Joseph and Mary had been so harshly turned away on their journey to Bethlehem. He visited the occupants of the inn that had extended hospitality to the holy travelers and instructed them. With those of the inhospitable one, he stayed overnight and admonished them to be converted. The woman of the house was still alive, though on a sick bed. Jesus cured her. Tuesday, February 7th. Then he passed through Aruma where he had been. Jairus, a descendant of the Essene chariot, dwelt in the neighboring and somewhat despised place Phasael. He had some time previously begged Jesus to cure his sick daughter, and Jesus had promised to do so, though not just then. Although his daughter was dead, Jairus now dispatched the messenger to meet him and remind him of his promise. Jesus sent his disciples on ahead after appointing a certain place in Jezreel, where they should again meet him, and he himself accompanied Jairus' messenger back to Phasael. When he entered the house of Jairus, the daughter lay wrapped in the winding sheet ready for burial, her weeping friends around her. Jesus ordered the neighbors to be called in and the winding sheets and linens to be loosened. Then, taking the dead girl by the hand, he commanded her to arise. She did so and stood before him. She was about 16 years old and not good. She had no love for her father, although he prized her above all things. He was charitable and pious and shrank not from communication to his daughter. Jesus roused her from death, both soul and body. She reformed, and after some time joined the holy women. Jesus warned those present not to speak of the miracle they had witnessed. It was through the same desire of secrecy that he had not allowed the disciples to accompany him. This was not the Jairus of Capernaum, whose daughter also was at a later period raised from the dead by Jesus. Now, I skip over Wednesday because it's just italicized. Thursday, February 9th. Jesus taught in Jezreel, where 1 month before he had publicly healed the sick, and performed many miracles before a great concourse of people. All the disciples from Galilee were here assembled to meet him. Nathanael Chancellor, Nathanael the bridegroom, Peter, James, John, the sons of Mary Cleophas, all were there. Lazarus, Martha, Veronica, and Johanna Chusa, who had come before from Jerusalem, had visited Magdalene at her castle of Magdalene to persuade her to go with them to Jezreel in order to see, if not to hear, the wise, the admirable, the most eloquent, and the most beautiful Jesus, of whom the whole country was full. Magdalene had yielded to the persuasions of the women and, surrounded by much vain display, accompanied them thither. As she stood at the window of an inn gazing down into the street, Jesus and his disciples came walking by. He looked at her gravely as he passed with a glance that pierced her soul. An unusual feeling of confusion came over. Violently agitated, she rushed from the inn and, impelled by an overpowering sense of her own misery, hid in a house wherein lepers and women afflicted with an issue of blood found a refuge. It was a kind of hospital under the superintendence of a Pharisee. The people of the inn from which Magdalene had fled, knowing the life that she was leading, cried out, "That's the right place for her, among lepers and people tormented with flows of blood." But Magdalene had fled to the house of the leprous through that feeling of intense humiliation roused in her soul by the glance of Jesus, for she had made her way into that respectable position among the other women through a motive of pride, not wishing to stand in the crowd of poor common people. Accompanied by Lazarus, she returned to Magdalene with Martha and the other women. The next Sabbath was there celebrated by them, for Magdalene could boast a synagogue. Subtext: Jesus in Capernaum, Genabris, and Chisloth Tabor. Friday, February 10th, 30 AD, We are now Shabbat the 19th. Toward evening, Jesus went for the Sabbath to Capernaum, though not till after he had visited his mother. He taught there and again took up his abode in the house belonging to the bridegroom of Cana. The disciples were gathered here. Saturday. Jesus preached all the next day until the close of the Sabbath. Numbers of sick and possessed were brought to him from the country around. He cured them openly before all his disciples and drove the devils out in presence of an ever-increasing crowd. Sunday. Messengers came from Sidon, begging him to go back with them, but he put them off kindly until a future day. The crowd became so great that at the close of the Sabbath Jesus left Capernaum with some of his disciples and escaped into a mountainous district about an hour to the north of the city. It was situated between the lake and the mouth of the Jordan, and was full of ravines. Into one of these he retired alone to pray. This is the same mountain range from one of whose spurs, when returning lately from the Mount of Bethanat with his disciples, they had seen the ships of Peter and Zebedee on the lake. The disciples that accompanied him went down to the dwellings of the fishermen near the lake in order to apprise them of Jesus' coming. Andrew had stayed behind in Capernaum, teaching and explaining to the assembled multitude. In the evening Jesus went to his mother's house between Bethsaida and Capernaum, whither had come Lazarus with Martha and the other women from Jerusalem. They were on their way from Magdalene and had called to take leave of Mary before returning to Jerusalem. He said that Martha was too anxious, that Magdalene had been very deeply affected, yet she would, notwithstanding, relapse once more into her old ways. She had not yet laid aside her fine attire, for, as she declared, one in her position could not dress so plainly as the other women, etc. Monday. As there now began in the city a fast of thanksgiving for the death of a man who, in violation of the law, had caused certain images to be set up in the temple, Jesus taught again in Capernaum. Again were brought to him the sick, of whom he cured many, and again did messengers come to invite him to the other places. There were at this time some very ill-disposed Pharisees around him, and they contradicted him on several points. They asked him what would come of all that excitement, for the whole country was in commotion on his account, since he was teaching publicly and daily swelling the numbers of his followers. Jesus rebuked them severely and told them that he was about to teach and act still more openly. On that evening began a fast in commemoration of the great victory gained by the other tribes over that of Benjamin on account of some shameful transgression. I saw that in the country of Hazael, where Jesus had lately raised to life the daughter of Jairus, as also in Aruma, Gibeah, etc., this day was kept with special strictness, since they had been the theater of those events. I saw that the women in those places made a certain offering and took a prominent part in the Feast of Atonement. That night Jesus, with Andrew, Peter, the sons of Mary, Cleophas, Judas Thaddeus, Simon, and James the Less, and of Zebedee, James the Greater, and John, was conducted by Nathanael Chancellor to Genabris, his own dwelling place. Nathanael had established there an inn for Jesus. He did not enter Nathanael's house, which, however, he had passed on the way to the city. Nathanael the bridegroom and his wife also visited Capernaum and Jezreel at this time. Tuesday. The place of baptism near Ono was guarded and turned by the inhabitants. Jesus taught in Genabris and cured some raging possessed. A road for traffic ran through the city. The inhabitants were not so docile as those near the lake, Although they did not openly contradict Jesus, yet many received his teaching coldly. Besides the future apostles, Jonathan, Peter's half-brother, was also in Genabris. The other apostles had scattered around Capernaum and Bethsaida, relating all that they had seen and heard of Jesus. Wednesday. From Genabris, Jesus went with the future apostles to Bethulia, about 3 hours distant, 5 from Tiberias, and not far from Jezreel. It lay on a height so steep that one might fancy it was ready to topple down at any moment. The fragments of its walls were so broad that a wagon could be driven on them. The road from here to Nazareth pressed Mount Tabor, from which it was only a couple of hours to the south. Nathanael Chancellor had at this time given over his office in Genabris to his brother or cousin. He was, for the future, to follow Jesus. When Jesus entered Bethulia, the possessed began to cry after him on the street. On arriving to the marketplace, he stood near a teacher's chair and sent some of his disciples with directions to the superior of the synagogue to have the doors on all sides of the school opened. Others were sent from house to house to call the occupants to instruction. The synagogue was surrounded by doors between the columns, and it was customary to throw them open when the crowd was exceptionally great. Jesus taught here of the tiny grain of wheat that must be cast into the earth. During his stay, he abode in an inn that had been prepared for him. So, a little aside here, referencing the parable he told in John 12, 24 to 26. I already know that's the one where he says, if a single grain of wheat doesn't fall into the earth and die, it doesn't create the wheat field. It just remains a single grain. So that's what he was referencing. Subtext: Thursday, February 16th, 30 AD, Shabbat the 25th. The Pharisees here did not indeed openly contradict, but they murmured. And Jesus knew that they did so because they feared he would celebrate the Sabbath among them. He told his disciples this, and that he would keep it about a couple of hours further on at a place to the northwest toward Tabor. I cannot now recall the name of that place, but the inhabitants were engaged in dyeing silk for fringes and tassels. Jesus also cured the sick there. All the disciples that had remained behind met here again. As Jesus, on account of the murmuring of the Pharisees, left Bethulia, he taught outside the city at the distance of about a quarter of an hour, where there was a teacher's chair of stone. Ruined walls lay around, and the place looked as if it might once have belonged to the city proper. At about 3 in the afternoon, Jesus arrived at Chisloth, which was almost 3 hours distant at the foot of Mount Tabor. Andrew and the others had preceded him in order to arrange the inn. A great multitude from the whole country around had gathered at Chisloth. Among them numbers of shepherds with their crooks and merchants on the way from Sidon and Tyre. Jesus' miracles and preaching were already noised throughout the land. All crowded to the places where he taught, and when it became known that he purposed celebrating the Sabbath at Chisloth, they flocked thither to hear him. Wherever Jesus now appeared, great excitement prevailed. They called after him, cast themselves down before him, and pressed around him in order to be able to touch him. Consequently, he came and went suddenly and unexpectedly, thus to escape the crowd. Frequently he separated from his disciples on the road, sent them by another route, and went on himself alone. In the towns and villages, they often had to open a way for him through the crowd. Nevertheless, he permitted many to draw near and touch him, and many a one was thereby interiorly aroused, converted, or cured. In the evening, Jesus retired to the inn prepared for him by the disciples outside of Chisloth Tabor, where he had already been twice before. Chisloth was perhaps 7 hours from Nazareth, though in a direct line about 5. As the roads of this country are so winding, running as they do through the valleys, and as the inhabitants determine distances sometimes by the length of the roads between two places, and sometimes by what it might appear to one gazing down from the mountains, their statistics on the point seldom agree. Galilee was thickly dotted with cities and towns, but from no elevated point could more than a few be seen. Chisloth Tabor was chiefly a commercial mart, in which were some rich merchants and a great number of poor people. Many of them were dyers of raw silk, which was afterward manufactured into fringes and tassels for sacred vestments. These dyers in earlier times were found principally at Tyre on the sea, but later many of them removed here. The rich merchants employed the poor in their factories. I saw here likewise some people who appeared to be slaves. The disciples, with thick ropes run through stakes, had cut off a space in front of the inn in order to keep back the crowd. It was from that space that Jesus preached. As among his audience there were many of the rich merchants from the city, he taught upon riches and the dangers attending the love of gain. Their position, he told them, was more perilous than that of the publicans, who more easily than they would reform. Saying these words, Jesus pointed to the ropes that separated him from the crowd and uttered the words, "A rope like one of those would go more easily into the eye of a needle than a rich man into the kingdom of heaven." The ropes were camel's hair, as thick as one's arm, and drawn 4 times through the stakes around the enclosure. The rich people defended themselves by saying that they gave alms out of their profits, but Jesus replied that alms that had been expressed from the sweat from the sweat of the poor bring down no blessing. This instruction was not pleasing to his hearers. Sorry, I had difficulty turning the page. But that concludes this reading. All right, so I had a few notes. First one, every cure that Jesus performs, he expresses a teaching with a miracle. So, and I've studied all the miracles in the Gospels. But here we're introduced to a couple new ones. So when we study every miracle he performs, we want to see what we can profit from it. So we have to examine all the variables at play. Now, in this case, Jairus was an Essene. He loved his daughter. His daughter was 16. His daughter didn't like how her father blended with low society, how her father expressed charitable behavior. Therefore, the fault here was all on the daughter, and yet Jairus loved her. So those are the variables. Now, because Jairus' love for her, she finally reformed and did so in a dramatic way of having literally died and become resurrected. And Jairus loved her so much he went to our Lord, that is physically, because this is the greatest love that you can have, that is to give your children Jesus Christ. And you do so by, I'll get to that. Anyways, that is to want them to experience God's love as you do, which is why he was charitable in the first place. Now, Jesus says in John that there is no greater love one can show than to lay down one's life for his friend. I am not contradicting this, but fulfilling it, because you would die for the love of God. When you would die for the love of God, you show others how much the love of God is worth. And you express love for them as Christ expressed love for humankind. You forfeit your life and endure suffering for their sake. And Jairus suffered for his daughter, and he wanted to give her Christ. It's the greatest gift. And he would have laid down his life for her surely. Now, where the daughter wanted to be uncharitable, wanted to excise low society like a tumor because she didn't like being connected to them, Jairus wanted to give them what he was given. The woman then suffered from another thing. She did not honor her father, which breached the commandment, and for the reason that he was doing good and she wanted to do evil. Therefore, when she died, it was like she was cleansed of that sin. She was baptized in a different way. So the next note. What we've learned of Magdalene so far in the text is that her mother was a Jew. Her father was a military commander, I think from Egypt, but he had been stationed in Syria and eventually became of such high accolades that he had been given land in Bethany, among other places. He was very honored. The parents, had many children. Many of them died, but among those still alive are Lazarus, Martha, Silent Mary, and Mary Magdalene. They were quite wealthy, so wealthy that they owned other properties. One such property was a castle in Magdala, where Mary Magdalene lived. Mary was a pretty girl, favored by her mother, and overly spoiled, which inflated her sense of vanity and increased her desire to live more of a lavish lifestyle, because she felt important. And she, like the girl I just talked about, Essene Jairus' 16-year-old daughter, did not want to be associated with the lowly. In short, she was what we call a snob. Here, Jesus just looks at her, and this causes her to flee among the lepers and the women who were considered unclean because they suffered hemorrhaging. She didn't meet Jesus yet, but she was wounded by his glance the one moment she looked at him. Last note, when Jesus teaches on mammon, we see a slightly different version of what he said in the gospel, where he said that it would be easier in the gospel for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. Some people interpret that to be a passage to Jerusalem through one of the gates. A gate called the Eye of the Needle. Maybe he was referencing that, but anyways, here in Anne Catherine's vision, and I'm sure she says he often repeats his parables with some variation. Here he's saying that it would be easier for the ropes of camel hair to pass through the eye of a needle, which of course is still physically impossible. Though we assume the needles they used were probably a bit bigger than the ones we associate with now. But the point is it's still physically impossible. But in the gospel, he says, for God, all things are possible. Now, it's a simple teaching. So I put it plainly. Those who put more in the life of the flesh than that of the soul actually build up their case against themselves. For not only do they neglect the purpose on this pilgrimage, not only do they fail to exercise the soul, which becomes weak and feeble and faint, they arm themselves with sentiment towards all which they have gained and stand to lose against their imminent mortality. They become attached to this world. The more you work to buy something, the more you want to keep it, and the less likely are you to think that what you have bought is worthless to the status of your soul. When you work to bring about God's kingdom, like the Franciscans who forsake earthly possession, the Franciscans armed their sentiments towards poverty so that their flesh would not work against them for the sake of their soul, their pilgrimage, so that they can profit maximally in the soul without cares of the flesh. And Jesus tells us over and over to the shepherds who live somewhat impoverished lives. Franciscans then work toward the fulfillment of God's will without being bogged down by sentiment for worldly things. And that's it. Ave Maria.